Hello, everyone. Bonjour, buenos dias. Thank you so much for joining and welcome to this webinar on Building Forward Better. We're going to be talking about economic opportunities offered by the wash sector. My name is Valerie Traoré. I'm the Executive Director of NIEL, and I'll be guiding all of us through the session. You received the invitation and you know what this webinar is about, but I just wanted to remind us all that it is part of a series designed to prepare us, all of us here, sector leaders, to engage with our own finance ministers, other decision makers and agencies in our countries on the need for increased investment for the sector. This session will provide practical information which we can all use in our institutions to make the case for better investment and to attract additional resources to the water, sanitation and hygiene sector. As we'll be spending an hour and a half together, I just wanted to make sure I give you a couple of housekeeping notes as well as walk you through the agenda before we get started. So immediately, the first housekeeping note, so that we know who you are, I want to ask everybody to put your names in the chat box now. Please tell us where you're joining from and if there's anybody else joining with you, if you're sitting with somebody else that you're working with or other colleagues, so that we're all able to know who's here and who we'll be spending this time with. The agenda will go as follows. We'll start with a keynote presentation by Bill Kingdom that will focus on the economic opportunities. We will do that for about 15 minutes. And then we'll have another presentation by Catalina Fonseca on increasing funding for WASH. Where should we start? And these are insights from the handbook that was launched a couple of weeks ago. And hopefully some of you were at the webinar during that. We'll then stop and give everyone an opportunity to ask questions, to engage with what has been presented so far. And then before we move to the next presentation, which will be managing the investment, making the investment case, for WASH specifically, looking at it from costing all the way to investing. And that presentation will be given to us by Guy Hutton with a case study from Myanmar as well, which we're really looking forward to. After that, we'll spend more time having a discussion and Q&A based on that presentation. And finally, we will look at what the preparatory process and the milestones, including on mutual accountability mechanism, will be by Sitali from Sanitation and Waterfall. So that's what we have for today. Let's get started immediately. Our first presentation will be the keynote for this session that is focusing on economic opportunities and the promises of the water sector. And Bill Kingdom will take us through that. Until recently, Bill was the global lead for water supply and sanitation in the water practice of the World Bank. He now works from the UK as a global specialist on water supply and sanitation in developing countries. He's a lecturer at Oxford University, and during his career, Bill has worked extensively in South and East Asia, Southern Africa, the Middle East, the UK, US, and Canada. He's now a senior advisor to Sanitation and Water for All. And on that note, Bill, hand over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Valerie, for the introduction. I have a number of slides to go through. I have to tell you, I'm not going to speak to every bullet point on the slides. It would take far too long. So please read them whilst I'm talking, and then we'll make sure that we get through them in good time, allowing for opportunities for discussion a little bit later. So if we move to the first slide, the basic question is always why invest in water, sanitation and hygiene? And in making this presentation, we're trying to see this from the perspective of the finance minister who will be participating in the regional meetings. So if we move on, the first slide, these are things which I think we all know about, the health, education and environmental benefits. The headline is the first bullet, 5,500 people die every day due to inadequate wash. And the next slide essentially picks up on, although it has a title which says Health, Education, Environment, it should have a title that says Economic Equity and Financial Benefits. And again, the first bullet is the one that is the headline that we typically speak to, which is that $1 invested in WASH delivers $4.3 of benefits. It's also interesting, particularly for a finance minister, to see what's happening with the subsidies that go into the sector. Huge amounts of money, $300 to $400 billion a year going into subsidies into the water sector. And unfortunately, based on a small study, but 10 countries, nearly 60% of the subsidy went to the wealthiest quintile, whereas 6% went to the poorest quintile. So, it's a sad reflection on the way the sector's organized, massive subsidies, but not necessarily going to the right people. If we move on to the next slide, again, this is more to keep building the case for why think about water. This was from the World Economic Forum. Water crises was seen as the highest global risk in 2016. It stayed in the top 10 subsequently, but clearly, there's a global issue around water. And if we go on to the next slide, we have to consider overlaying on top of what I've just said, what's happening as a result of COVID-19. And these were the figures from last week. 30 million infections, more than 1 million deaths, pretty much every country in the world affected. And this is a public health issue. And of course, WASH is a public health service. So it's important to link public health and WASH to economic and employment issues, which we will in the next two slides. If we could move on to the next one, please. This basically, again, this is a little bit about advocacy, WASH, COVID, the economy. Only East Asia and Pacific is forecast to have any growth in GDP. Every other region in the world is expected to see a contraction. So obviously, the issue of the economy and keeping the economy going is important when we think about how WASH can help do that. If we go to the next slide, this comes from the ILO, and it looks at how working hours have been reduced in the first 2 quarters of 2020 as a result of COVID. So whilst, what we're trying to do here, I guess, is bring together the fact that we've got a public health issue, and WASH can contribute to that, and we've got an economic and employment issue, and again, WASH can help address those issues as well. So if we go to the next slide, basically, just for this presentation, I tried to organize around 3 themes for finance ministers to think about. The first one is respond, which is what I guess every country is doing at the moment, how to ensure continuity of service provision and expand service to help control the spread of COVID. We can't be in response mode forever. We have to think about recovery. So that is about building towards universal access. That helps with employment opportunities. We have to think about sector reforms and continuing those as part of recovery, and talk about new sources of finance. And Katerina will discuss that in the next presentation. And we thought about a third R. Many of us were brought up on the idea of the 3 Rs as being the core of our education: reading, writing, and arithmetic. So I struggled to come up with the third R beyond respond and recovery, and came up with revitalize, because as a sector going forwards, we really need to revitalize what is essentially a very kind of risk-averse and conservative sector into one which is a lot more dynamic and aiming to achieve the SDGs, not only for the purpose of having universal access by 2030, but obviously in terms of trying to improve the professional status of the sector, the service quality, and so on. So if I move to the next slide, response. These are just some numbers around the financial impact of COVID on providers. And the numbers speak for themselves, and they're what you might expect. Revenues are down, revenue collection rates are down, bad debts are up, and there's a widespread postponement of capital projects. So that's the kind of financial impact that is arising as a result of COVID. And if we move to the next slide, the sorts of things that governments can do to ensure service continuity are listed here. Some governments have given deferments on payment of water bills, or even cancelled them altogether. Obviously, that reduces revenues to providers, so governments have to make sure they recompense those providers accordingly. A lot of work's been done around the idea of a national liquidity facility to ensure that service providers can access funds, guarantees, supply credits for essential commodities or inputs. All these are the kind of things governments can do at the moment in terms of responding to the pandemic. We move to the next slide. Why focus on WASH? From a financial perspective, we all know prevention is better than cure. And WASH is an essential preventative element. We've been using this term, the pre-vaccine vaccine. It will be several months before there is a vaccine against COVID. But in the meantime, washing hands regularly is an important preventative action that people can take. And that kind of is why we use this term, the pre-vaccine vaccine. So these are the kind of things that can be done. Now, in the worst case, people end up in hospital. And a ventilator, I looked online, costs around $40,000 to treat someone in intensive care as a result of COVID. Yet, you know, at $150 to $300 per head to put in a water system, that ventilator could provide anything between a service for 130 to 260 people and 20 years of benefits that will flow from that. So if we move to the next slide, this is the trade-off that we ought to consider. Investing in the pre-vaccine vaccine, i.e. WASH, is probably beneficial compared to spending money on these very expensive and complex ventilators. So if we move on, recovery, I mean, here I've just kind of listed the areas: expanding access, which delivers better jobs and the health benefits and so on that we've talked about. There are some no-regret investments which should appeal from a simple payback perspective in terms of energy efficiency and leakage reduction, and also using up spare capacity. Many systems have spare production capacity. So get people connected to use up that spare capacity should be considered a no-regret investment by sector and finance ministers. And as I said before, it's not all about investment. It's about the softer side of the business, improving governance, improving creditworthiness to deliver the kind of benefits that I've noted there. And the first one I think is probably most important going forwards: reduce the burden on public finance, because public finance is going to be in short supply as we move forwards. So anything that can be done to keep that money for more deserving causes, perhaps, which don't have a revenue stream is beneficial to a government. So trying to improve the financial kind of management, as it were, of WASH is important. If we move forwards to the next slide, labour-intensive investment programs. We found this photograph of a pipe laying in Nepal. I think a finance minister might be very interested to see, the dollars of public funds that go into a water system can keep many people employed, digging trenches and laying pipes. So just a nice kind of figure or photograph to kind of illustrate the point. If we move forwards, over the years, there have been a number of studies to look at employment in WASH. And so this is the kind of business case. There are several examples that have come out here. The bottom one's interesting. Obviously, sanitation is important. This was some work done by the University of Pretoria and said, look, we could create 100,000 jobs if we started to move everybody onto VIP on-site latrines. So if we go to the next slide, whilst these ones were all, as it were, studies, these are the reality. So these are examples from around the world, looking at how jobs have been created through investment in WASH, and not only jobs, but also creating new businesses. And obviously new businesses create new opportunities. They also create tax revenues for the government. So there are a number of examples here, and perhaps countries that have been through crises before already have these systems in place. So Argentina, for example, when it was recovering from its crisis, ended up with this Hache program, which created a lot of jobs in the Buenos Aires area, and particularly employing youth, which I think is an important factor in any employment program. If we move on. So if we can quickly type through or press 4 times, this is essentially showing how if you invest in energy efficiency and reducing leakage, you can improve the creditworthiness of service providers, utilities, and that will allow them to access new sources of finance. So the next click is simply what happens if you add in a bit of tariff increase. I don't think that's on the agenda for now, but certainly the black bars are all things that are under the control of utilities, and investing in energy efficiency and leakage reduction have big impacts on the creditworthiness of utilities. And we'll see in the next slide, please. This is an example on energy efficiency from Uzbekistan. It looks at different interventions, but on the right-hand column, the payback periods are really very short. And a finance minister ought to be interested in those kind of investments. And not only does it reduce costs and have a payback, it's also greening the economy at the same time. The next slide just illustrates how attention to leakage, which also has significant financial paybacks, but in this case, I just wanted to illustrate how in a service area of 1 million people in Ho Chi Minh City, leakage reduction delivered enough new water to service 500,000 people. And this wasn't by massive replacement of pipes, it was actually by finding and fixing thousands and thousands of leaks that had built up over a period. If we move to the next slide, this is just part of the Revitalize. Click through a few times, please. It's probably 3 or 4 times. Essentially, what this, one more time, please. What this shows is if we revitalize and we start to get a bit more creative, off-grid customers are a large and growing portion of the population. They have zero subsidy. They are the poorest in society, and they have to receive a service like that one on the right-hand side with jerry cans filled with water delivered by young men pushing carts around. Now, what we could do is completely think about a new system on the left, having small little trucks that can go around delivering delivering adequate quantities of water on demand, and basically improving the COVID resiliency of water supply, whilst also meeting the SDG 6. If we move on, please. So this is really something for Katerina. I'm not going to talk about it, so let's move on to the next slide, please. Overall, in the sector, we are definitely not short of solutions. Everything that I've talked about, everything that we know about, whether it's challenges related to governance, to finance, to technical performance, to capacity building, to incentives, to capital and operational efficiency, there are volumes and volumes written about this. There are examples and examples all around the world. We are not short of solutions to our problem. But what we generally lack is a really strong political leadership. And if we move to the next slide, we can see how critical political leadership from the top level, including finance ministers, sector ministers, prime ministers, in Southeast Asia, looking at South Korea, Malaysia, and Singapore, WaterAid did a study which showed how universal sanitation was possible within a generation with strong political leadership. It came down to leadership from the top, a well-coordinated approach, continuous engagement from the top, and a vision. And of course, this vision idea can be seen more recently in India with the Swachh Bharat mission to eliminate open defecation. Prime Minister Modi managed to achieve the bulk of that in just 5 years. An incredible achievement, but driven by politics from the top. So if we move to the next slide, which is the last slide, it builds on this. So the political leadership, it comes from everyone. Where can finance ministers help? So they can continue to invest in WASH to prevent the spread of COVID, as I've mentioned, and to provide the foundation for the long-term health, economic, and employment benefits that flow from WASH. So they need to ensure continuity of service provision. This is happening with support by governments to service providers. More could possibly be done. And then obviously the investment side, expanding service, which provides employment opportunities, as we've seen, and these kind of no-regret investments which improve efficiency and creditworthiness of borrowers. So the money side's important and the investment side's important, but the reform side is equally important. We cannot forget that even in a crisis. So we have to continue to support reforms that will improve governance and creditworthiness, allow new sources of finance to be accessed, and reduce the burden on the public finances, which I think every finance minister is going to want to do going forwards. So that was my overview. I just wanted to set the scene, try and get people thinking along these three themes of respond, recovery, and revitalize. And I hope I've done that in 15 minutes. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bill, for that. As you said, it just sets the scene and sets the stage for everything. There are already a lot of questions coming, including some around the politics, including many around examples that you've given several and people want to know more, and even one on subsidies. But I already know that Katerina is going to address that in her presentation. So I'll move us right along. And then after Katerina's presentation, we'll come back to some of those questions that people have asked in the chat, and then also the questions that they would have had after Katerina's presentation. So this is really insights from the book, How Do We Make the Most Out of the Investments in WASH? And the presentation will be given by Dr. Fonseca. She's trained as an economist, has a doctoral degree in water sciences. She has more than 20 years of experience in the water and sanitation sector, working with governments and civil society, mostly on cost and finance, which is really what we're talking about today. Until recently, she was the head of the international program of IRC and is now an independent consultant. She's a senior advisor of Sanitation and Water for All and is one of the co-authors of the SWA Handbook for Finance Ministers. And without much more than that, Katerina, it is over to you.
Thank you, Valerie. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues from all over the world. Thank you for being here, listening to us. I will try and address a critical point that I've been hearing quite a lot from colleagues as well, which is, okay, but where do I start? Where do I start in this whole engagement with finance ministers, or at least with Treasury and with colleagues from Treasury? Next, please. So for those of you that don't know yet, SWA launched a handbook for finance ministers. And I have co-written, I had the great pleasure to co-write it with Bill Kingdom, who you just heard, Victoria Delman from the World Bank, and Leslie Porris from water.org. You can download it from SWA website. I'm sure there will be a link put somewhere. And this has really been a global multi-stakeholder effort to collect the best cases, the things that really have worked from all over the world, from different countries, and different types of development in the water sector, and really inspire both finance ministers and mine ministers on what works and how to move forward. Next, please. So what is the content of the handbook? And I'm going to spend quite some time in this slide and the others that derive from this, explaining and getting to the point of where can you really start, depending on where you are. So finance ministers can improve water and sanitation for millions of people by supporting specifically policies in 4 key areas. And this is how we try to organize them. By maximizing value from existing public funding, by mobilizing more funding. So one is doing best with what you have. The other one is actually getting more funding. And then increasing repayable domestic finance. I'll come back to what this means, and tap into innovations and least explored approaches. The first thing I want to say is that the first 2 areas, so the dark blue and sky blue blocks of intervention, are typically they do mobilize more resources than the other areas. The other 2 areas, we also have less documentation and less success cases. So, and the ability of low and middle income countries to actually mobilize additional finance, repayable financing, and explore the innovative approaches, so to tap into the light blue and the green areas, is really highly dependent on the ability of the sector to demonstrate that you're making good use of existing funding. So the last 2 blocks are dependent on how you're using the existing funding. Next, please. So for each of these areas of intervention, we have about 20 country cases. Why are they here? Well, one, because actually we could access information on them, but because they have all one thing in common. They all require the cooperation with colleagues from Treasury, all of them. So what does this mean? How can you maximize value from existing public funding? Well, incentivizing sector performance. Very important. Bill started talking about it, improving subsidy targeting. This is a low-hanging fruit. It's an easy one. You can get a lot of money by targeting and designing subsidies better. We have examples from Chile, Colombia. I would say also ONEA, Burkina Faso, has a great case on how this has been done. Also promoting better sector planning and management. There's the cases of Cambodia, Mozambique. I would add also Mali to that list. Then mobilize more funding. Well, this one is, again, very much comes from governance in a way, is setting up adequate cost recovery policies with a lot of tariff reforms, introducing specific earmark taxes and this is really an important one if you want to get into sanitation, which is a difficult one to fund from other sources, and to reach poor populations, and establishing an array of options of cross-subsidization. Then finance ministers can also be involved in increasing repayable domestic finance by creating mechanisms that reduce perceived risks of investment in the sector, by pooling finance at national, municipal, and household level, And here we have a lot more examples from Asia and from countries which have more sophisticated water sectors and finance sectors. And finally, we found one case which already is seeing good results on accessing climate funds from Kiribati, and one, the first social impact bond for the sector from Cambodia. Next, please. So what are the main sources of finance for this type of mechanisms? The first two types of measures, finance comes mostly from domestic public funding, which are taxes, tariffs, and also transfers from donors, but this part is actually quite a small percentage in the overall source. And the other two measures come mostly from public and private finance that involve mechanisms where loans have to be paid back somehow. Of course, I'm generalizing, but I think it's important to see this difference because, next. What I see in a lot of discussions on financing and involving finance ministers is that we spend a lot of time discussing the right side of this diagram and not the left side of the diagram. The first two types of measures mobilize more funds and are relatively easier. Why are they easier? Because they are more on the soft part of governance that Bill was also mentioning. They fall back on processes that already exist in countries. They might not exist for the water sector, but they certainly exist for other sectors. The last two approaches are on the right side. They require more sophisticated systems in place that might not be there. For instance, specific regulations that ensures that the sector is not seen as risky to invest in. However, every time that we engage in finance discussions, the discussions tend to go to this right side. So my first recommendation of where to start is to start close at home. Of course, it depends on where your country is, the status of development of the sector. But I don't have time to show you all the examples, but I'm going to show you two examples of how this can be done. Next, please. So I'm going to give you the example of Mali. Mali started by actually understanding how much money is going into water sanitation and hygiene by using the TRAFFIN methodology in 2015. This was done with the support of WHO, UNICEF, and WaterAid. When the first report was published, it showed that the water sector was getting just a bit over 1% of the national budget and had not changed much over time, even though the national budget had been increasing over time. And this was much below the estimated needs. So they checked how much money they were getting and how much money they needed. The Ministers for Water and Sanitation presented the TRAFFIN findings to the Cabinet Council, which is chaired by the Prime Minister. In 2018, the water budget more than doubled to 2.62% of the national budget, including plans for 100,000 water connections for the most marginalized in the district of Bamako. Next, please. Something a little bit more on the sanitation side. The Ministry of Environment and Energy in Costa Rica established the water discharge environmental fee, basically a tax, under the premise that those that produce pollution must bear the costs. Between 2016 and 2018, this fee has collected, the fees collected led to an investment of $1.2 million directly for going to help the rural operators which had lower financial capacity for developing sanitation projects. And this has supported the national efforts, and there was also a strategy for this, to leave no one behind. I'm just showing you 2 of the 20 cases of the handbook. Next, please. But since, again, I do train a lot of large groups of colleagues from all over the world, and since the handbook was launched, colleagues asked me, okay, great, we go for the first time, for the first type of measures, but then they come with a list of 100 problems about why their countries cannot access even this type, cannot undergo this type of measures. So they ask me, where do we really start? I cannot go through all of the 100 problems and the questions that I'm sure are coming through the chat boxes, but I'm going to focus on 3 that I hear frequently. So the first one is I can't ask more funds to my finance minister or to my treasury colleagues because the water sector does not even manage to spend the existing funds. We have low absorption capacity year after year, so we have no internal leverage. This is one I hear a lot. The second one, we have too much backlog of rehabilitation. We have a lot of infrastructure with massive, that took a lot of investments to be built, that is not working. Or my ministry does not have enough staff or enough skills to actually deal with the backlog and rehabilitation. And the last one that I always like to discuss is, well, the problems are too many. My country is very poor. There are many areas with no services. These are very difficult and very expensive to reach. It will take time. Where do we start? And you might wonder, well, what does this have to do with ministers of finance anyway? Next, please. Well, they have to do with ministers of finance because I think all of the solutions or most of the solutions to these problems do require collaboration with Treasury because they are outside of the water sector to solve. And some of them are underlined. I don't have to, I see the time passed. So this is my before last slide. So for instance, on the issue of low absorption of existing funds, find the real causes. The real causes are very different in different countries, and they might be a combination of different causes. So one, sometimes it's not even the fault of the water sector. When public financial management systems means that the districts or the service providers are getting their budgets 7 months into the fiscal years, and if they don't spend it until the end of the year, it goes back. This is not an issue just concerning the water sector. This is public financial management, which is Treasury's responsibility most of the times. Sometimes it has to do with the type of funds that are transferred. I've seen in many countries, you can start analyzing their books, and you start seeing that all the budget goes to salaries, for instance, and there's no money for fuel, for per diems, for doing monitoring, for doing maintenance. Maybe there is O&M, so minor maintenance. Large maintenance, never there. So you have huge teams at district level, a service provider level that are there, but do not leave their offices and are not able to perform their roles because there's like a little bit part of the budget which is not salaries. Or the lack of accountability mechanisms. If there is no checks and balances, it's much more difficult to actually have a carrot in terms of spending the funds. This is where performance mechanisms can work in this, when the problem is this. Or other countries have too many funds flowing off budget. There's a lot of things happening outside of the planning of the ministries, and it makes it very, very difficult to actually spend existing funds and manage and make everything aligned with the vision of the country. Next, please. Too large backlog on rehabilitation. Again, don't just hear the problem and accept it. There are many causes of this. Maybe you do not have asset registry. I'm talking city level or national level. Asset registry, how many assets do you have? What's their status? Maybe you have an asset registry, you know the status of all your infrastructure, but you don't have a an asset management plan in place. So far, this is the role of the water sector, but maybe there's no budget lines. They are not allowed in your public financial management for preventive maintenance, for instance, and this requires Treasury. Or also very much I hear this a lot, and clarity of mandates for large maintenance is very unclear. Where are the boundaries? Who should be paying for it? Who should be implementing? Next, please. Finally, leaving no one behind. First, we need a strategy for decreasing inequalities. I think in this case, there are many times, I think it's very useful to have collaboration with other sectors, especially health and education sometimes have strategies already, and they have been done together with, there are more national goals in terms of reducing inequalities, who they are, where they are, and I come back to this, what measures are most effective and which one are not. At the moment, we have a lot of measures in the water sector via subsidies or tariffs that are really not effective. And we don't have much data on it. There is this amazing study of the World Bank that Bill mentioned from last year, but we do not have a lot of country examples of digging into it. Burkina Faso, a couple of years ago, revised all their subsidies, both for water and for sanitation. Based on that, they revised all their tariffs, and the tariffs are cost reflective of some maintenance costs, and they know exactly how to get the money for backlog and rehabilitation, for instance. Also, some of these are in the handbook. My last slide, I think, or one before. The last thing I want to say, and this bridges to what Guy will also talk about, is goals without a finance plan are just wishes. With no financial plan, you cannot mobilize more funds. Start with existing problems, go to the depth of it, show results in some of them, and once the sector is seen as more effective and trustworthy, then finance will be mobilized. Final slides, please. You can use the handbook. It comes with a lot of advocacy tools and little videos and GIFs. It's very simple language as well for non-finance people and experts. The complementary tool is the costing tool that Guy will go through. And SWA has also set up the Systems and Finance Working Group, which has had our first meeting last week. We would like to very much support influencing strategies both at international and national level or regional. We would like to support you in some of the preparatory processes, maybe providing some technical assistance in some areas, but this is all demand-based, and the demand needs to come from your constituencies. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Katarina. And I'll actually ask that you keep your camera on, because we're going to have a few minutes for questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to have too much time because both presentations were so good, and you answered some of the questions that were already in the chat before after Bill's presentation. But there are maybe two sets of questions that I want to put back to both of you. Maybe start with Bill. There's one set of questions around the politics of it. In terms of the arguments are there, the messaging are there, but some of the choices are about balancing the economic choice, which makes sense, balancing supporting everyone and the poor to have access and leaving no one behind, but yet some of the choices that are being made are not necessarily based on that. So where does that argument sit, and what would you suggest? The example that was given is when you talked about subsidies, for example, what can be done there? An example in Nigeria around, again, the political choices that are made rather than basing it on some of the arguments that are put on the table. So do you have any examples where that balance was struck in a way in recognizing some of the challenges that may be there? And then one question also was around, within COVID, could a government have said free water for everyone that needs it, which would probably be a strong political argument, but yet what does that mean in terms of everything else and not creating dependency as it may? So that sort of questions. And then I'll come back to you, Katarina, after Bill has addressed that, because there's also a set of questions around cross-sectoral relationships. And you finished your presentation talking really about the support in influencing policy, so the role of different actors, parliament, media, as well as how to bring in other sectors within that. So I'll start with Bill to address that, and then we'll try to come back to you, Katarina, and see if there's any follow-up based on that. Over.
Thanks, Valerie. I guess politics is at the heart of so many of the challenges that the sector faces. It's quite hard to believe in 2020 that we don't have universal access to water and sanitation. And those countries that have achieved it have seen it as a political imperative. So the question is, to what extent can we engage with politicians to really help them better understand how WASH can figure into development of a country? There's one picture in the front of the handbook which shows the difference between countries that have universal WASH versus countries that don't in terms of their GDP growth. And there's a massive difference between the two. So I guess, we've got to do a better job at convincing politicians that actually this is a good way to go for the economy, for the public health aspect, now from the employment aspect and the pandemic response aspect. But they have so many other choices where they can put their money and their leadership. So somehow we have to demonstrate that this is the one where there will be big dividends. And, you know, if politicians aren't going to be open to that, then we've got a challenge. But I think, you know, it's becoming clearer that WASH is central to responding to COVID. And if we can make the case that it's actually important in terms of employment generation prospects going forwards, creation of businesses which will last beyond the COVID crisis, these are the kind of things that perhaps can help move the needle more in our favor. Now, free water, you know, again, that's a kind of political issue, and it's very attractive politically, but also I think from a basic health perspective during the pandemic, it may make sense. But notice that some countries haven't said it's free. They said you can defer payment. So you've been given a kind of period where it's free, but you'll have to come back. But it can generate, as a guy I think suggested, that there's a dependency on free water. Getting people to go back to paying for water will be critical. So the theme running through all my responses is about communication, either with politicians or with consumers, to kind of really try and show that what's being done makes sense. Showing what's being done or could be done is sensible politics and sensible policy, but also showing that, you know, ultimately to get universal access to improve quality of service, free water actually isn't the solution. And that's the bit that, you know, maybe politicians don't want to hear at the moment. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Before you completely stop, there's a and your presentation as well as Katarina's and of course the book gives all of the arguments for why it makes political sense, why it makes policy sense, and why it makes development sense. And do you think it's taking that and then turning that into why it makes political sense? Because part of the question is, does it serve the state also? And there is a gain there as well that can be had. Yeah. Is that what I'm hearing in terms of communication?
So in a way, yes. I mean, the communication is there, but I mean, I guess the ultimate question for a politician is this going to help me get re-elected? And maybe at the moment it might. You know, the COVID pandemic is also an opportunity. So if I come offering universal access, because people are paying for water regardless, it's not like it's really free anywhere. So the offer of universal access could become a vote winner within the context of the COVID pandemic. And that's what politicians are perhaps equally interested in, apart from good policy and good development. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Katarina, now over to you. A lot of questions around multi-sectoral and cross-sectoral relationship. And one last one is, again, the argument around what what you gain or what the state gains by investing in sanitation is also when you're in a context where everybody's fighting for resources. So you have other ministries that are also making those arguments. How do you push for a greater cross-sectoral relationship? How do you push for that joint access, but also making sure that the WASH sector gets enough resources, and at the same time, questions around involving other parts of the society, be it parliament or media, to do this advocacy and to carry this communication? Over to you.
Thank you. I think I'll divide it in three. So the first point on the integration and the collaboration between ministries of finance and water ministries. Again, I'm just going to give examples from cases that I know quite well, that I've been engaged with at certain points. I think some of the things that really work is when you have platforms. Just a second, please. When you have platforms in countries, so usually the countries have a donor platform or a multi-stakeholder platform. And most of these platforms in the sector, some of them started including other representatives from other sectors like health, for instance, or education. But most of them lack actually someone from Treasury. And when I mean someone, I'm talking about high-level representation, to have this spokesperson, someone in the finance ministry that can talk water sector, and having someone in that platform that can bridge between the water sector and the finance ministry. I know this is the case with very active platforms in Burkina Faso, in Morocco, and they are active for quite some time. Now, there are two conditions for this to work well. One is that without the heads of state, without your presidents, your prime ministers actually believing in the sector, and the sector being some sort of having some political priority that Bill was also mentioning, the political leadership, I don't think either the collaboration between the water ministry and the finance ministry can be very strong, but without that bigger leadership, I don't think they can go very far. And the second one is when the second condition for this to work is when that vision from the heads of state is then put into a plan to achieve the SDGs in 2030, a plan for achieving SDG 6 in 2030. When we talk about plans for the sector, is really for all the subsectors: water, sanitation, rural, urban, costed. How much does it cost? And then, okay, it costs this. We are going to have from tariffs, from taxes, from we get loans. This is how it's going to look. This is the plan. And then you can have everyone in those platforms aligned in one vision. What I've seen in many of those platforms, when there is no plan, is that you just have agencies with their own agendas putting money in specific areas because, well, there is nothing to align to, so I want to do something good, so I want to do this. And then another agency wants to do something else, and it's very difficult to get actually to move forward if we continue to work like that. The second part on the budgets, it's interesting to hear, if between this fight of budgets between the water sector and other sectors. But actually, if you look at the past 10 years of some of the share of the water sector budget in national budgets, it's like a flat line. It's like if you're in a hospital and it's like you're almost dead. So you see the national budgets increasing, and the education budgets and the health and others, and you see the water sector budgets flatlining at below and not increasing. And it's not a fight. It's not because the finance minister does not like the water the ministry or the sector. No, if you have year after year, you're spending 75% of your budget, why would the finance ministry give you more money? But you need to get to the bottom of that. So I don't think it's an issue of fighting for resources. It's really an issue of making the case for the water sector and saying, okay, our budget has been 1% of national budgets, which is very, very low, which was the case of Mali in 2015, which is the case of Madagascar. It also has been extremely low over the past 10 years. How can we increase it to 2 or 3%? What is going to be my dialogue with the finance minister? What are the areas we're going to tackle to show that we can spend this money and that we are trustworthy to make things move forward? Now, I've been talking a lot about government at the moment, and it's very nice that you asked me the last question on the role of other types of stakeholders. And I work very much with civil society, and it gives me great pleasure to work with civil society in the water sector. And the first thing, and the media, and getting these allies between civil society, the media, and local governments is very, very powerful. The first thing is when I know, I don't know, probably all the colleagues here are of the water sector, but when I talk about civil society, most people think about, you have your fist in the air and you are fighting for your rights, and it's very dissent. But in the water sector, there's not like parties against people having water and parties against people having no water. No, it's known. It's a human right, is known. It's the government responsibility to provide water and sanitation. We have targets. It's known. There's no doubt about it. So actually, the dialogue approach has proven to work. I've been working with a large consortium over the last 5 years in 6 different countries and internationally. Dialogue works. And the interesting thing is that both civil society and the media can join hands with the water sector technocrats, with our colleagues, with our service providers, our district officers, to actually build a case. And the whole situation with COVID allows for this. It has made things in a way easier. I'm just going to give you the last example. This happened over the summer in Kenya, in Kajiado County. We had at prime time over a week, radio DJ just talking about the budgeting process. What was the budgeting process? How could citizens talk about their priorities? And water is a big issue in that area. So water was one of the issues. So and he would receive calls from citizens during that 1 week and that 1 hour prime slots. It's incredible. We had illiterate persons being part of the budget process of their county. And this is possible. Citizens are not, they might be illiterate, but they're not stupid. They know that they deserve having water from their taps. They know that they deserve dignity in having a toilet. And having more informed media into what some of the issues are, it's not difficult to have media talk about budgeting processes and to have them talking about why does the budget only get to a specific district 7 months or 8 months after it has been allocated. And they talk in a different language than we talk, and they reach different people. And the media also reaches the policy side. This is where it all comes together. And sometimes it can be faster to go that way than to go all the way through the platforms and the formal platforms. I've seen a lot of change happening to that side. So it is possible.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And it's a great transition into the next piece around making the case. And we've seen that as well in a lot of the work with media that we've been doing in Benin, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, that really the engagement is real and at all levels, all different groups, policymakers, private sector, and communities can really get engaged together. On that note, I do want to move us along because we have another fascinating set of presentations around making the investment case for WASH, from costing to investing. And the presentation will happen in 2 phases, and I'll let Dr. Guy Hutton introduce the Myanmar speaker later. But to kick us off, Dr. Guy Hutton is a senior advisor for WASH at UNICEF. He's based in New York, where his work focuses on system strengthening, economics, and financing. He's been collaborating with SWA for 10 years now, providing evidence and publications on the investment case for WASH. So we couldn't have a better voice to take us through making this investment case. Go ahead, Guy, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Valerie. Thank you very much. The last 2 presentations, I think, have set up my presentation perfectly. So if you want to have a conversation with the Ministry of Finance, or with donors, or even with the private sector investors, you've got to know what you need. You've got to know where it is, which populations, and so on. But you need concrete numbers for that. You need a perspective, you need a plan, as has been said. Costing is not difficult, but surprisingly few countries have done a full national costing of their SDG WASH targets. Essentially it just needs you to have credible evidence on the coverage levels. It needs you to have some idea of what is currently being spent in the sector so that you can compare the needs against the available resources to understand the financing gaps. And it also helps to have established national standards and norms in order to know what you're costing, the minimum standards and norms at least, which allows you to do the costing. But the costing does help you also reflect back on those norms and standards as to whether they are realistic norms and standards. And hence it's can be a good thing to do a costing of different levels of norms and standards to see what is actually affordable for the country and for people if they have to pay for it. So next slide, please. So for some years, we've been implementing this costing tool that I will present today. We believe over 40 countries have used it. We've heard back from many of them. It is based on a model developed while I was still with the World Bank with Millie Varghese, which estimated the global cost of meeting SDG targets 6.1 and 6.2. While that study is now becoming a little outdated, the $114 billion needed per year for capital costs, we've updated the sanitation side of that this year, and we'll be releasing a report soon. But what we need is for more countries to pick up this tool and adapt it and generate their own estimates. Next, please. So the tool is simple, Excel-based model, and anyone can understand it now. There's a lot going on behind the sheets that are visible, but essentially you just need to work with what you see. So the model focuses on new infrastructure to serve the unserved. So what is the gap in basic services? What is the gap in safely managed services? We did adapt the model so that we do a costing of maintaining existing infrastructure. So that is also presented in the results. And for those who don't have services, we assumed that in the absence of any other sort of appropriate assumption, we assumed that they would receive 15 equal tranches to achieve the targets by 2030. So a sort of straight line progression in access. But some countries may plan it differently, either a sudden acceleration or more progress near the end, but we assumed equal progress. It includes capital, software, and operation and maintenance costs. And it was a global study of 140 middle and low-income countries. So at the time, we basically drew data from every different source we could find and populated the model. So when you look at your country, you will see some default values, but you need to study those values and change them as you can. So next slide, please. So the tool is downloadable from the SWA tools portal in English, French, and Spanish. And so please do find it there. It's best to save the file with your country name in case you share it with SWA. It contains 3 simple sheets: a user guide, which is just an instruction, a data verification sheet where you see the default values that we used in the global study for your country, and you have a chance to change any of those variables to update to your for your country. And then there's a third sheet, which is the summary report sheet, where there's a number of automatically generated graphics and some tables for you to copy and put into reports. So all the calculation sheets are hidden, but they can be viewed by unhiding them. But it's unless you expect to change them, it's better not to go and play with those. The guideline that you see here is was printed and circulated. It's available online in the 3 languages. And well, there is a global help desk. Either contact SWA or contact me directly. Next, please. So in the data verification sheet, there are a number of variables that you can change. Next. So first you will identify your country. Next. So first you identify your country. There's a pull-down menu where you select your country. Next. And a new feature, because in 2017, when we first distributed the model, we were using 2015 baselines. But now, as we're moving into the sort of middle of the SDG period, we need to do updates. And so the model was adjusted this year. All the underlying sheets were adjusted so that you can change the baseline year, and that'll allow you to calculate costs from that year onwards. Now, if you only have 2017 data, such as reported by the JMP from the national surveys, then it will still be 3 years out of date. But if you have more recent data, then you should certainly enter in for 2019 or even 2020 to make it as current as possible. Now, all the other variables that can be changed are the following, and next, please. So these include technology choice, the coverage in the baseline year, the target coverage in 2030, whether you're aiming for 100% or whether you're less than 100%. You can adjust the duration of the hardware, how long the capital items last for. Then you can add the unit costs, the cost recovery rates, and the current financing available. And then you can tabulate your results either in US dollars or in your local currency. However, all the data should be entered in US dollars. And then if you want to tabulate in local currency, then you'll make a choice in the tabulation sheet to view it in local currency. And you need to enter the exchange rate with the US dollar. So this just provides a visual of how the sheet looks and what you have to change. This is just a small capture of part of the sheet. Can you, next 4, please? So you can change the technology. So basic water in urban areas, you can have up to 2 choices. That's all. So if you have more than 2 major choices, you would need to fold them into only 2 choices. Unfortunately, that's the limitation of the model. Next, please. And for safely managed, as at the time we only had one sort of service level being targeted with limited cost data, we only had one option for achieving this. So that's one other constraint. Next 2, please. Then you write in the proportion of population who will receive each of these technology choices. And then you add in the baseline year and the coverage target in the next 2 columns. Next, please. Next. There's further on, there's some columns relating to unit costs and cost recovery. Next 4, please. So here you'll put in the capital costs, reflecting the per capita costs in total, and how long the technology, the hardware is expected to last for before it needs replacement. And then the gray, so the brown columns are the 2 main sort of sources of funds as to whether it comes from the household or it comes from a subsidy. Now, if there's private sector investment, then that is expected to be recovered either through the tariff or through a PPP where there's blended funding and there's subsidy. So these 2 columns need to add to 100% in order to be full cost recovery. And then on the operating side, operating costs, it needs to be cost per capita per year to provide that service level. Next, please. So you can view results. I won't go through this in detail. You choose your currency. Next, please. So you can see by service level, by basic, by safely managed, by water, by sanitation, and by hygiene. So it's all there. You can, if you want to change some of the data or assumptions, then you would either save it as a different file, or you can just copy the results into another sheet so that you don't lose the original results. Next, please. And in terms of the financing gap, in order to calculate that, you will need to enter in the data verification sheet some what the sector is currently receiving in terms of national budgets, so subnational budgets, and overseas development assistance. So that if that's entered, then you can calculate financing gaps, which come in the summary sheet. Next, please. So this is a conclusion. The analysis is only as strong as the weakest data point. So if you put in one very wrong data point at some point, then it'll generate spurious results. And so you've got to pay attention to what you're changing in the sheet. This is very ballpark. And what we're hoping this exercise does is to stimulate dialogue on national financing and possibly motivate a more detailed investment plan which is more decentralized, and you really have different data for different areas of the country, so that you can reflect all the different specificities. So with that, I would like to introduce next, please. One case study. In fact, this is not a case study in the use of the costing tool. We thought it was better to show an example where a country has set up their own study and gone about it in their own way. And so we're very happy to have Mr. U Kanzor, the Director General of the Department of Rural Development in the Ministry of Agriculture, Livestock and Irrigation, who will just give a brief overview of how the costing exercise was conducted in Myanmar. So over to you, Mr. Zor. We're not getting the next slide.
Okay, now I already selected the English now. It's okay. Thank you. So at the time of the developing the investment plan, there are the very limitation of the data availability at the time, and also very limited commercial financing, and also that the tax of the government is very low, and it's a low tariff on the existing water supply system at the time. So the opportunity at the time is because of the government reform project, so positive trend on business and transparency, and also high investment interest at the time. So I'm not saying only the water sector, also the other sector. So, and we have the federalization agenda, and also under the regulatory reform process. So next slide, please. Okay, so scope of the investment plan is, so we define cost of the cost of achieving and sustaining national water strategy objective 2016-2030. So it includes rural area, school, healthcare facility, and emergency preparedness. So we estimate a funding requirement for capital and also recurrent costs. So we review the potential funding sources according to the plan, not only government, but also donor and also the user. So there may be no experience of the country from the user. So, but in Myanmar case, so also we can get the contribution from the user for the better service. For the business service, government totally invest in. So there are some challenges in the implementation for the plan. So because there's non-standardized data set, so we heavily depended on the census data as the main source. So multiple ministry to coordinate and different structure at the state and regional level. Because in Myanmar case, there are more than 3 ministries are responsible for the water sector. So as because of the different structure, different state and regional level, so very difficult to coordinate at the time. So Budget planning project will focus on the incremental capital cash for was with the limited period consideration of support costs and also the recurrent costs. And also one of the challenges is the short-term budget planning horizon. For the WASETA, at the planning stage, participation of the stakeholders, actors, and participation of the user community is very important. But so participation means it takes more time. So that's why planning project or the calendar planning project for the government is a little bit short time to get the enough participation, meaningful participation of the stakeholder. So and another one is so require extensive regional consultation and face-to-face workshop to know the right target, because the actual targeting is at the ground level, because was not only the one ministry, so that's why we need the extensive regional consultation, face-to-face workshop. And next challenging for the implementation is there's no priority in the worst sector, because now in Myanmar case, so other development activity like the real access road, electricity, also the important one. Now government priority is top priority is the road and electricity. So that's why our water sector is the north priority. So this is the difficult and challenges for the water sector. So next slide, please. Before explanation about that slide, so let me continue a little bit remaining about the challenges for the, because of the ongoing conflict in Myanmar. There are some conflict in Rakhine, Kachin, and Shan State. So implementation that conflict area also there really needed, and also very difficult challenges for the implementation. Methodology about the investment plan. So. Methodology is to establish physical needs. So we mainly sensor data and through the consultation with the state and region. So we use the existing sensor data and also bind the consultation at the state and region and township level, we can get the target. And we translate into the cost. The cost is very significantly between state and region due to the topography, geology, and also the access, and also different from the source, and also the different technology. So for the sensitive analytics to understand where risks were with estimate and be transparent about uncertainty and area where information needed. So review of available financing. These are the big challenges. So this was limited and a lot of information are known or available, because limited longer term budget planning possible at the time of preparation. Limited scope of private financing, because there's no economic potential, no business potential for the private sector during in the developing period until now, and also significant regulatory reform still needed to attract the private sector investment. So next slide, please. Let me share some results from the implementation of the investment plan. Now, because of the what strategy and what investment plan, now we have the detail. We have the detailed cost plan. Even detailed cost plan, we still need to modify yearly according to the condition. So better coordination and understanding between ministry on role and responsibility, because of the frequently coordination meeting among the sector. Strengthen understanding of data, need for effective estimate, and focus more attention on recurrent costs and importance of longer-term budget planning. So in both ministers had a starting point for multiple other investment plans that had come since that could be built upon. So greater attention on M&E and MIS to generate better costing plans. So now we have the better M&E and MIS system that need to complete. We're positioned to fit into MSDP, Myanmar Sustainable Development Plan, and start bidding a project that can fit into the project bench to attract, to get the donor and international investor. So one of the key result area is the community contribution and also the community participation at the planning, not only planning, implementation, and also the operation maintenance stage. So another key result area is local government contribution increase yearly. So at the beginning of the investment plan 2016-2017, at the time, most of the budget come from the union. Now, because of the cost plan, because of the work coordination at the state and regional level, we can get the more contribution from the local government. And at the time of the developing of the investment plan, there's no data for the simply managed. Now, so we are implementing state, and now the biannual sunset data. So according to the data, according to the MIS, according to the coordination, now we can see some data related to the safely managed. These are some results from the implementation of the Myanmar Watch investment plan. So, but we still need to do a lot to meet the 2030 agenda. So what are the next to do? To continue strengthen the state need to strengthen the monitoring, M&E, and also the MIS system to provide better financing. Because without exact data, we cannot allocate the budget for the right target area. So that's one. So to strengthen M&E, MIS also the important one. We will continue that area. So we will keep conversation going between ministry involved in the West. And also we will start preparing bigger scale and bankable project that can be submitted to the project bank. So to attract the private sector and to get the donor. So we will explore innovative financing solution with national and eventually international donor and financing partner. So more work needed to on financing strategy to bid on the costly. Not only now we now know roughly how much it costs, but we still need to know how we are going to pay for it. So keep referring definition of role and responsibility within the ministry to ensure effective cost allocation, and also ongoing mainstreaming of the environmental, social, and governance into costing and financing consideration. But also we will mainstreaming during the implementation periods. So thank you for your attention. These are some lessons learned and experience on the Myanmar investment work plan. And so these are some experience during the 5-year implementation period. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zhao, and thank you, Dr. Hutton, as well, for taking us through this, how to make this investment case, and an example of how that was done, and especially what you've learned from it. There hasn't been a lot of questions coming through, just mainly an appreciation for the tool, what it can do, and an appreciation for what you've shared as an example, and what are some of the challenges, especially that you have seen in Myanmar, and how you are planning to move on to the next level and where that is going. So I don't see many other questions come through. So I, again, thank you both for that, because it now gives us a really clear, not only what the tool looks like, but a really clear way in which this tool can be adapted. As a result, I'm just going to move straight on to Sitali to talk us through what are the milestones in the preparatory process, including the mutual accountability mechanism. Muyatwa Sitali works with the country engagement team of the SWA Secretariat, so really telling us how the engagement is going to be happening and what are the next steps moving forward. Sitali?
Great, and thank you so much, Valerie. I hope you can all hear me well. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. So I would just start by reminding us that we will have 3 regional virtual finance ministers meetings. One for the Africa region on November 4, and then 2 weeks later for the Latin America region, another 2 weeks later in early December for the Asia and the Pacific region. Most of the countries, or rather all the countries that are partners of SWA plus more, have already received invitations. So sector ministers and finance ministers have received invitations to attend this meeting. Invitations have also been sent to several other partners who also have to attend the meeting. The meeting will also be live, and it'll be live broadcast to most of us, so we can be able to follow it. Can we get to the next slide? The next one, please. So I just want to highlight the several other slides beyond this one, which will be helpful for you to understand some of the activities around the preparatory process. But I just want to put this summary as a way to consolidate the preparations. So we have a guidance document which would help you with the preparations. This guidance document is on the website. If you have not yet received it, please get in touch with us or check on our website and you should find it there. And then if your minister or ministers have received invitations, please just do check that those invitations have been passed on to the right people. And then we are looking forward to receiving confirmations for participation in the meeting. We've already started receiving some, so we're looking forward to receiving more confirmations. We're asking all partners at the national level to engage in multi-stakeholder preparations and discussions. And by this, we imply that the government focal point should lead in bringing all actors together. That includes the civil society, the private sector, the development actors, such as donors, UN agencies, the development banks, as well as the research and learning agencies. We would like to ask that when partners come together, they can specifically look at aspects of water and sanitation that relate to the topic of the finance ministers meeting and be prepared to carry analysis and prioritize what investments need to be made, but also be clear in terms of what commitments are being undertaken by government and what commitments other partners are also doing. These multi-stakeholder discussions are extremely important. It is also important that the government lead those discussions. It is also important that all the other actors participate in that. If you are in a country and you are not aware of these discussions, do get in touch with us. We'll put you in touch with the government focal point. And then we are asking that the result of these multi-stakeholder discussions should be a country overview, a very brief document that articulates the issues related to water sanitation financing and how the government and other partners can address the main bottlenecks in that challenge. And then we also ask that during this time, this is a very opportune time to look at the commitments, what commitments have been made before, and how to review those commitments and report on those commitments. It's really important that we should be tracking these priorities with progress. The week before the finance ministers meeting is a week that we're calling the WASH Finance Week. We're encouraging partners in every country to really use that moment as a key moment for communications, for media, and for engagement with other partners through television discussions, radio discussions, social media conversations, newspaper and other discussions. And then finally, it's the attendance at the actual meeting. Now, as I said, there are several other discussions and support that we can offer as a secretariat, including the handbook that has been presented, as well as other materials that are also available, including on the mutual accountability mechanism. Get in touch with us and we'll be able to work with you on that. Currently, there are bilateral discussions going on with each country. If you have not yet arranged a bilateral meeting between your country and the regional coordinator, please get in touch with us. And at the global level, we're speaking to different constituencies. Valerie, I'll end at this point and thank you so much. Looking forward to the next conversation, which will be regional webinars in about 2 to 3 weeks from now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sitali, for taking us through that and just mapping what the next steps will be and how everyone on this call and outside can continue to be engaged in this process. We're coming to the end of this hour and a half, and I don't want us to go any further than we have already taken your time, but I hope that this was definitely useful. It was definitely useful to me, and really appreciate the depth and the brilliance and of all the speakers and their ability to help us chart through how do we make the finance case for WASH and how do we engage with our different ministers and ministries of finance and in support of our sector ministries. I do want to end before thanking all of the speakers by just letting you know several people have asked that the recording of this webinar will still be available on the SWA Secretariat's website in a few days. If you have follow-up questions, either directed at the Secretariat or even at any of the speakers, you can still reach out to the Secretariat and they will reach out to the different speakers, and hopefully you'll be able to get different answers to your questions. I know some of them have been happening already in the background of this call, and you have responded. We have responded in the live chat. One other announcement is that on October 1st, SWA will be hosting a South Learning and ministerial level dialogue on sector financing as a way to expand WASH services and sustain them beyond the COVID-19 crisis. I think it was clear from all of the presentation, there's a responding now, but then what happens post this in terms of rebuilding, etc. As with this one, as with other South Learnings, this event will start with a specific country initiative. This time, the country initiative will be in Madagascar, and I hope I'm pronouncing it right, Avortania, the operation in Madagascar, which seeks to reach the most vulnerable urban populations with essential WASH services. We've also talked a little bit about leaving no one behind and how would we really address and ensure that those who are the most vulnerable get access to adequate and inclusive WASH services. The event will include Madagascar's WASH Minister, who will discuss with the domain expert the country's challenges in sector financing and possible actionable solution as a great transition to this particular webinar and what we can do later. So do mark your calendars. It's on October 1st, and there will be further details that will be shared by the Secretariat. Like I said, we're coming to the end. I do want to thank every single one of the speakers, Mr. Zaw, Guy Hutton, Katerina, Fonseca, Bill Kingdom, all of you, and everybody who's helped make this happen, the Secretariat of SWA for pulling us together. And I hope that all of us have gained, as I said, I have gained so much from this conversation, and we'll continue to engage as we prepare for October and November, the Finance Ministers meeting. So thank you all, and it has been great to engage with all of you on this.